is the video a distraction?
Are we going to go through the social process?
Turn it down, right? Right. Yeah, the green one's still on.
And who are our judges? Okay, we got 4? Yeah. 5. Whoa. Okay, just making sure.
Is everybody ready? George, I just have the resolution now? Yes. All right, perfect.
Someone says.
Well, today we're talking about feminism, whether or not it is harmful to the pursuit of equal rights or not. Now, the resolution is pretty straightforward. However, we're going to provide a couple of definitions in order to provide some structure in today's debate round. Feminism is the belief that women are and should be treated as potential intellectual and social equals to men. It is looking at the status quo right now, basically determining whether this is true or false. Detrimental is harmful, and equal rights, basically saying that each and every person as an individual deserves the same amount of rights, and we get equal rights for all. Now, it's basically a resolution of fact. We're analyzing this idea of, is the resolution true or is it false? Either feminism is detrimental to equal rights, or it is not. It stands to be affirmative that it is, and we're showing this to you through 2 on-case points. Now, by looking at whether or not this resolution is true, we're going to be looking at preponderance of evidence and logic, basically analyzing the status quo and seeing, is this true or not? My first point is that we're blurring the scope of society. Blurring the scope of society, that is what feminism does. First sub-point under this is that it's self-victimizing. That you're basically saying, because I am a woman, I am discriminated. Basically inherently saying, I am at a sub-level of everyone else. Today's feminism teaches women to see themselves as victims and men as perverts and bullies, and we see and as misogynists. So we see that the feminist currently worldview necessitates a dim view of the male race itself. It says, because I am a woman, I'm the victim, and men are and the reason this is happening is because of men. It puts men in a bad place in this way. Now, my second subpoint under this is that it's very isolationist, and this comes from Griffith, which is a muted group theory, and it's basically talking about how men and women are speaking different languages, specifically concerning the fact of feminism. How this idea of men don't understand me, basically putting men in this category in the side, saying, because you're a man, you don't understand me. Feminists going to this other group and saying, okay, women, let's gather around, let's talk about our problems, our issues, what we need to talk about here today. So we see it's like this idea of 2 ships passing in the night. We don't see a common language between men and women, and this idea of feminism creates that idea. The idea of feminism is basically a form of discussion or dialogue for women and their problems, and the patriarchy itself. It's between women concerning women's problems, and it's not a discussion of equality. It's saying, because I am a woman, I have this problem. They're creating their own language in this way, basically disenfranchising everyone else and not having this communication, this form of discussion that we need to have in order to pursue this idea of equal rights. Which brings me to my second contention, that of it undermines equal rights. Now, Patricia Artek, she said at the Oscars in 2015 that that we fought for everyone else. Now it is our turn. What is the underlying assumption of feminism? Subpoint A is that it's assuming all these other problems are solved in the status quo, saying all these other problems are solved concerning race, concerning gender discrimination, concerning even men, equal rights for men. They're saying that everything else is solved. Now we need to focus on women because we are the sole problem right now in the status quo, creating our own idea of discussion. This idea of masculinity, how men should be able to cry. It's okay if you're a man and you cry, or it's okay if you want to wear pink. Or if you give a compliment to another man, it doesn't mean that you're a homosexual. Also this idea of African Americans saying that we should have equal rights for all. It's assuming that women are the only problem in the status quo, and that's what feminism is doing. It's undermining the promotion of equal rights, which is the equal rights for each and every individual. Doesn't matter your sex, doesn't matter your gender orientation, doesn't matter the color of your skin. But what feminism does is it basically creates a group. It pulls all these women to the corner and says, we're going to solely talk about our problems, our issues. We're not going to talk about equal rights. We're talking about the problems of women themselves. And for this reason, we see that as a resolution of fact that feminism is detrimental to equal rights. Thank you.
First question for you. You speak of feminism, right? I want to find out the different kinds of feminism that exist in today's society.
I'm sorry?
Are there different kinds of feminism in today's society?
The one that's on the forefront that is most known to society as a whole, holistically, the one that is popular within the status quo, is the one being perpetrated, such as the definition that we gave.
So if all those people speaking bad about feminism are speaking about man-hating, that's what you're saying?
I'm sorry?
All those people speaking things about feminism are perpetuating man-hating, that's what are you saying?
Are perpetuating man-hating?
Yeah.
Essentially, yes.
Feminism itself is basically saying because I'm a woman, I am victimized, specifically because of the patriarchy, specifically because of men. Yes.
It's just because of men that women are seeing themselves as victims, that's what you're saying?
No, we're not saying just because of men. It's saying the way the voices are portraying the message of feminism and attaining this equality, it's creating this connotation of I'm a victim, all men are bad, misogyny and things like that. The way the
So
message
you're
is
saying
portrayed.
specifically it's the way the message is being portrayed, correct?
Absolutely.
Well, does that necessarily affect what specifically feminism is actually meant to do?
Yes, when the voices of feminism, such as Patricia Arquette, when she accepts an Oscar, says that now it's time for people of color, it's time for men, it's time for gay people to fight for us now, to basically state that these things are over. The voices of this movement, when they are saying things like that, it is a voice of it. It is a showing of what this movement is.
Okay, are there still problems specifically for women's rights across the world?
For women's rights across the world entirely?
Yes.
Yes.
And all other groups as well. However, feminism fails to acknowledge its other
Yeah,
groups.
there are women's rights all around the world, but they're not the only problem.
We're not
Not
saying that the
only.
problems of women have been solved. We're just saying that everyone's problems need to be
So
addressed.
if anything solves or specifically tries to solve for equality, does that inherently make it wrong?
If you're trying to solve it for equality, that makes it wrong. Is that
Does
what
it?
you're asking?
Does it?
Trying to create equality
Solving
is
is
not.
not wrong.
No.
But when it
Solving
suppresses other
equality
voices
is
and the
not wrong.
voices of the movement itself are suppressing people, that's when it
So
becomes
the
a problem.
voices are wrong, not the movement.
Yes, because they are contributors of the movement. They're the voice of the movement.
Okay, I have 5 minutes. Sorry, going from normal to this is a bit difficult. All right, is everyone ready? Okay, I'd like to thank you all for being here. We have hit our opponents once before, and always, as we've seen them, they are excellent debaters. So let's jump right into the case. The first thing I'm going to get into is some resolutional analysis, specifically dealing with the case. The definition of feminism, specifically, we need to look at feminism as a whole. So the idea specifically of not only women's rights, but the idea of equality specifically in that manner. And now they're saying that it's detrimental to equal rights, meaning that in the status quo, it's actually harming equal rights. So they bring up the first point specifically going over the idea of the scope that society has. Yet and still, one thing that we have to focus on is what feminism does versus what feminism is perceived to be. They're two separate things. And what they show specifically is the idea of the perception of feminism. When you actually look at feminism as a whole, feminism has multiple parts within itself that don't necessarily agree on every aspect, but in the end what you see is the common goal is specifically to fix the problem of women's rights. Now, the second contention they look at is the idea of undermining the idea of equal rights, turning women specifically into the victims. Yet and still, they continue to ignore the fact that there are still women who in turn are discriminated against across the world. Now, we will actually bring this up specifically in the off case. Now, getting into the off case, going into resolutional analysis, first they actually have to show specifically that inherently what we see is a cause of harm to equal rights, meaning feminism in and of itself is actually harming equal rights, not the perception of feminism, but feminism. This leads into point number 1, feminism, subcontention A, the idea of multiple types. According to UAH.edu, what we see is that there are actually 5 types laid out of feminism: liberal feminism, radical feminism, Marxist and socialist feminism, cultural feminism, and ecofeminism. Now, all of these, specifically what we see, have a different approach to trying to solve a problem. Does that necessarily make feminism inherently wrong? No. Let's do a comparison to the idea of utilitarianism, the greatest good for the greatest number of people. When you actually look at the concept, what you see is that the concept in and of itself makes sense, but what makes utilitarianism so bad is the way that it has been implemented in many ways has actually caused a negative connotation, specifically looking at the idea of communism. So what we see specifically is that because of what it's perceived to be, or because of what they perceive it in today's status quo, they are therefore saying that it's wrong, but inherently it is not. This leads to subcontention B, the idea of incorrect perception. What we specifically see is that the movement for gender inequality was originally conceived as a struggle led by women only for women. What we actually see specifically in recent years, men have actually begun to understand and are actually addressing many of these inequalities that exist, meaning that these inequalities are not something that women are just griping about, they actually exist in the world. Now, specifically, where do they exist in the world? This leads to point number 2, the idea of relevance. Subcontention A, that the inequalities are still here. What we look at specifically, going to money.cnn in 2015, they actually have a list specifically of women board members in multiple countries and the percentage that you find in these higher areas of work. Now, what we see is that the top 5 are Norway, Finland, France, Sweden, and Belgium. And the highest, Norway, has only 35% of women in these positions. Why? It's not necessarily that women don't have the education, so where's the actual problem lying? Let's actually go specifically to the United States, one of the supposedly most progressive nations in the world. We're sitting at number 10 with only 19.2% of women in this area, yet and still they want to say that this problem does not exist. Now, let's move on from there. The idea of women in the Middle East, also according to CNN, shows that they're actually beat men in education, yet and still they're losing out in work. This inherently doesn't make sense. We then go to the idea of Saudi Arabia, where we see that women are not actually allowed to drive cars or ride bicycles on public roads. Afghanistan, where we have women who are actually fighting for access to equal education. These are still problems that are inherent in the current system. Many of these problems. Moving from there to cover the third contention, specifically the idea of benefits, what feminism actually does. What we see specifically is is actually not an empowerment of career women, specifically when it comes to defining defining changes in the industrial world. What we're actually trying to do is specifically show that, number 1, these problems exist through feminism, but at the same time, feminism not only says, hey, these problems do exist, but hey, these problems are unequal and they need to be solved for. Therefore, when looking at equality, because these problems exist, because feminism for years has been working to solve these problems, then feminism in and of itself is not actually detrimental to equal rights. So with that, I would like to stand down and ask for a vote for the negative ballot.
All judges ready? Opponent?
Yes.
All right, ladies first.
Would you agree that perception is based upon action?
Well,
I have a perception of someone based on what they do or don't do.
Well, not necessarily, because when you look at
Then
the
what
idea
about
of
my
perception and
perceptions?
action, what we see clearly is that feminism is still working to solve many of these problems.
Then how are
What we
perceptions
see
formed?
specifically is because of the actions of a few,
Okay.
you're trying to judge the
So,
entire
by the
concept.
action itself, why is feminism perceived this way?
Why
does
is
it happen?
feminism perceived this
Yes.
way? There are actually 5 specific reasons why it's actually outlined, and this list was actually composed by a man. And what we see specifically is he points out 4 specific reasons, because some individual feminists do hate men. And what we see with this is specifically that though it does exist, this
So-
does not
So the
have
actions
all.
of the feminists
The
themselves.
second thing we look at
I'm sorry, so
specifically is
feminists
because
are viewed as hating men, correct?
some of them are, but
Alright,
not all of them
could you
are.
contest my point talking about how feminism basically creates a form of discussion between women, among women, excluding men? This idea.
No, because it doesn't exclude men. What it's doing is specifically trying to solve the
So if
problem.
it doesn't exclude men, why would this author feel like he would bring forth these statistics stating that it?
Well, number 1, you didn't actually allow me to finish the other 4 specifically.
Okay.
But number 2,
The
specifically.
article, the existence of the article itself and the information brought forth talking about feminism having this negative connotation,
Well, no.
why would it exist?
Once again, the idea of the benefits. When we look at the idea that these inequalities still exist, what you're basically claiming is that these women are complaining about absolutely nothing, where we clearly see that these inequalities are going on across the world.
So you're saying that it's the affirmative stance in today's round that feminism is bad for women?
No, you're saying specifically that feminism is detrimental to equal rights. At any point,
Did
that
you
feminism
concede-
is
did you
trying to
concede
solve
to
for
the-
equal
did you
rights,
concede
which
to
clearly are not
Did you
equal at
consider
this
the
point.
framework talking about equal rights as a whole, not just for women?
Yes, and when we look at equal rights in any aspect, if there's anything left
Do you
out, then why
believe
does it
that in
matter?
Belgium and these other countries, people are still trying to get gay rights as well?
Yes, and
It's
what
not
we
as
also.
pressing as women, because when you look at the statistics for white women,
Oh, so
Oh, I'm sorry.
African American rights, gay rights, and all these other issues aren't as pressing as women?
Well,
No,
when you
no,
look at
wait,
African
wait,
American rights specifically, we had an entire movement for that. So are you saying that that was?
Oh, so it's
wrong?
okay. Everything's fine. Okay. All right, all 5 judges ready. Our opponents ready? My partner Danielle? All right. Well, judges, people haven't done this, so I'm just going to go ahead and do it. Proper IPDA protocol, I want to thank you really quickly because there's a lot to cover. But I also want to congratulate our opponents for making it to IPDA National Finals. And I also want to thank my partner for being a great partner throughout this entire process. And with that said, I'm going to jump into some argumentation. Let's look at the last quote by the affirmative team in today's round. There was already a civil rights movement. These things have already been handled. So where did we hear that? Patricia Arquette, when she was accepting her Oscar in 2015 of this year. It's time for women in America and all the gay men, the people of color, to fight for us now. And what is this problem? This connotation of feminism is showing us that we should put women to the forefront currently and ignore these other issues. Which is why we have our first contention of that is blurring the scope of society. That's why in the resolutional analysis today, we offered you that equal rights is everyone, not just women. I want to make it very clear that it's not the stance of the affirmative team in today's round to say that feminism is bad for women. What we're saying is that it's bad for equal rights. If we're just focusing on the rights of women and ignoring people of color, ignoring gay individuals, if we are ignoring the rights of everyone else and just focusing on women, it's detrimental to these rights, which was not refuted by the negative team in today's round, talking about how having equal rights is a multifaceted sphere. So therefore, just focusing on women is detrimental to it as a whole. Going into the off case presented in today's round, talking about basically how women, the relevance, and how inequality still exists in Norway and Belgium and the French women, and how these things are bad for women, and women are still having a hard time. But when you look at Russia, when you look at these exact countries that our opponents brought up in today's round, when you look at other countries in the world, and you look at the rights of people of color, when you look at people that are homosexual, when you look at these other people that are left out completely by the negative team in today's round, that is the exact problem. They got up here and told you that feminism is a good thing for women, which it is, but it's a bad thing for equal rights as a whole. And that is the argumentation of the affirmative team in today's round. Going further into the argumentation, talking about the benefits of them, and women still need this fight. Yes, feminism does offer benefits for women. But when we look at it as equal rights as a whole, it doesn't offer the benefits for everyone else. I'm going to extend upon the argumentation that my partner brought up, talking about how feminism does not target African American women, how there are people that are left out. When you look at the how people view feminism, the perception of feminism, which we stated, the perception is perceived upon what people say. But Patricia Arquette thinking that things that are of color issue, things that are of gay issues are in the past, that is how feminism is perceived in the status quo, because these are major advocates for this cause. So when you look at this, you see that women, you look at Patricia Arquette, a white female, and the advocate for feminism. And this is from the Huffington Post in 2014. The writer stated, and I quote, "Before I'm a woman, I am black first. And the feminist movement leaves out women of color holistically." So when you look at the status quo, and even women that are of color being left out, feminism has historically not only left out women of color, it has deliberately thrown them under the bus. And the women's suffragist movement said, quotes, "If black men can vote, why can't women?" This is the advocation of the affirmative team in today's round. Why is this happening? Because feminism is blurring the scope of society as a whole. The entire advocation of the affirmative team. Talking about our second contention, talking about undermining the equal rights of everyone. When you look at women of color, this is according to the Washington Post 2015, women of color are paid less than the average white woman. The wage inequality is worse. So when we're just focusing on white females within the status quo, the perception of feminism, the perceived thought of the equality for women as a whole, we are leaving out multiple people. And it's detrimental to equality. When we concede to the framework in today's round of equality as a whole, we have to advocate of equality for everyone. And that is what the affirmative team is doing. And with feminism being in the status quo and being presented like it is and being taken out like it is, and issues of African Americans, people of color, and gay issues being thought of as a past issue, and we only need to focus on women, it detrimental the equality of these people. I now stand ready for cross-examining points of clarification. Thank you.
All right. Is everyone ready? Are you all ready? Okay, so the first question I'm going to ask specifically deals with where you're going. Now, you say specifically that feminism specifically leaves out African American women, correct?
Absolutely.
So why specifically are you, as the affirmative, only focusing on the African American women in the equation?
Because I'm talking about other facets of equal rights, and you would see negative.
Okay, well, what about other races that also need equal rights?
We're
We're advocating for everyone.
rights overall.
Okay, so the idea of women in other nations that also aren't necessarily black and aren't necessarily white somehow doesn't.
You can see that the women in these
nations.
nations are struggling because the feminist movement only focuses on white women within.
Yet it's still your case constantly focuses on the problems with specifically African Americans.
Like I'm talking about people, women in Africa, women in Saudi Arabia, they're still having these problems because the feminist movement is only focusing on white females currently.
Okay, so you're saying that it's only focusing on
that's why they haven't.
So at the point that we can show specifically that it's not only focusing on white females, then
it is. That's why the other women of other colors are still having these problems in other countries.
Okay.
Because the white females in America are the only ones that are successful.
So are these other countries actually trying to be solved for at this point?
But it's not being solved for. They're
It's
being
not being
left out. You stated within the status quo, these problems still exist in these
So
countries.
if the problem still exists, doesn't that mean that in essence feminism should try to do something to solve this?
Feminism isn't targeting it. It's a problem for these females.
Where's your
That's
evidence
what
showing
it's
that it's not, if it's specifically fighting for equal rights among the sexes?
It's not fighting. It's of white women. It's
Of
not
white
fighting
women?
for
Is
women.
that in your definition of feminism?
That is what.
No, we're talking about
Okay.
feminism as discussion as a whole is basically creating these subgroups. It's a discussion of women's problems among white women predominantly.
Only white women, that is your definition.
The argument that the
No, because
So
the
your
argument,
definition
no.
of feminism doesn't include white women, so why are you
I-
specifically
let
even
me
suggesting
because
that?
we're saying that's what feminism is.
Then where's your evidence to show that it's only
Your
focusing on
argument
white?
stating that women of color in other countries are not getting any benefits.
I specifically also
specifically-
showed where these inequalities exist in America. Were you paying
Showing
attention to that?
that strides are not being taken in these other countries of women of color shows specifically that it's only benefiting white females. My card stating that black females are still paid less proves the resolution in today's round.
No, you have 4 minutes.
Everybody ready? Open show. For
speech for today. Thank you so much. Very, very exciting. Let's really jump into what has happened in today's round. First and foremost, there's a really misconstrued understanding because first in the cross-examination, as Mr. Johnson says, he says that white females are also being paid less and African American women are also being paid less. Judge, imagine, does in the United States, in the status quo right now, are white females paid more than African females? Well, no. Women as a whole are being paid less than men. Right there, you see a wage gap. You see a problem of not having equal rights for women and men. I don't see where the equation comes for African Americans as well as whites. We are not advocating any kind of white privileges or African American privileges here. We are advocating for equal rights for women and men. That is not supposed to be misconstrued in today's round. Going on to the first contention provided by the negative in today's round. There are really different kinds of feminisms, and it's really the perception, not the movement in and itself. As we provided different kinds of feminism, as I reiterate, liberal feminism, radical, Marxist, cultural, all these kinds, the perception of man-hating, as I've cleared in the cross-examination also, at the end of the day, all these kinds of feminism aim at solving the broader perspective problem. The broader perspective of the problem is that you want equality with men, not at the expense of men. Excuse me. That's from Spark Summit 2014. You do not want it at the expense of men or at the expense of something else, but you want equal rights for women. And that's the reason when we show you developed countries like Sweden, Belgium, they have less political representation of women, like 25%, like 39%, even in the United States itself. That itself shows in the status quo the relevance of feminism today. And all these perceptions coming from the radical feminism, it's not really coming against man-hating, but at the end of the day, they need equal rights for men and women. It's the perception, not the movement. It's really misconstrued in today's time. Speaking of that, the sub-point in the first contention, speaking about incorrect perception. From the United Nations Initiative, speaking of the He for She campaign, very popular, made by Emma Watson, she says that, the website says that the movement for gender equality was originally conceived as a struggle led for women by women, as the Affirmative also quoted. But in recent years, men have begun to stand up in addressing inequalities and discrimination faced by women and girls. Quote-unquote discrimination that involves whites, African Americans, and other races also. You're not undermining anybody's ethnicity or race or their problems they're facing. You're looking at a broader perspective, and this encompasses everything and anything. We're not undermining gays or homosexuals in all these matters because men are also joining these movements. The second contention speaks about inequality still existing. We speak out of many different countries facing these problems, developed countries as well as underdeveloped countries, as well as in the United States in and itself. The pay gap, nothing new to speak about that. Secondly, currently women hold only 99 of 535 seats in the Congress, 20 of 100 seats in the Senate, 79 of 435 seats in the House of Representatives. You see these problems. These are very, very relevant as of now, as of today. Also expanding upon that, the percentage of women holding stable legislation is just 25%, which is barely higher than 1993. What do you see? The relevance. We are fighting for everything. We are not undermining gays or homosexuals here. That's what the Constitution has been in today's round. The third contention, speaking of benefits. Why are we speaking of benefits particularly? It is because for every person. Right now, I really want to quote this today from the FBI. It has triggered the feminism, right now the movement to have equal rights, it has triggered FBI to change the definition of rape to include men, to include the idea that women are not the only victims. You're not portraying women as victims as said by the Affirmative, but you're trying to show that men can also be involved in women being the victims here. So that does not really necessarily undermine or get race or ethnicity issues here. We're not undermining anything. That being said, their whole on case, they speak about a bag for equal rights, and they speaking of women, they see themselves as first as black and then as being undermined. Let me quote Viola Davis. She just won for How to Get Away with Murder, and she didn't really perceive her as black first.
All of our judges are ready. Opponents? All right, great. We were referencing like the UN and talking about how it was targeting like feminism and discrimination with women and things like that. How does discrimination equate to black people as well?
Discrimination is existing in the status quo.
So discrimination just is directly linked to black, everyone of every color, or is it were they specifically talking about discrimination of women, which is what it was made for?
Wait, what exactly is the question?
You stated that since it said discrimination when they were like female discrimination, it was like it's going to include African Americans and everyone else.
Well,
Women
the thing
needs
is
women,
that the
period.
difference between the information that we have and the information that you're arguing that feminism specifically only accounts for women. Yet still what we see with the statistics is the statistics themselves don't include the race of the women themselves. So when we're looking at this, we're looking at specifically the problem as it
But your
occurs.
statistics do state that women of color in other countries aren't reaping the benefits that westernized white feminism.
Well, we're showing specifically that even in the Western nations we're behind.
But they're still a stride more than in these other countries where women are of color, correct?
Well, there is a stride.
Okay, what is feminism?
Feminism,
Yes.
in and of itself, as you define it specifically, is the idea of striving for equal
All right,
rights among the
it's
sexes.
the discussion of women's basically inequality.
Not just women among women, but women with men and everybody. That's what we're trying to make a point of. It's not just women fighting just for women, because men have also been involved. As you see the United Nations initiative.
Okay,
It's not just, there are many men in
With
this
the-
room
with
right
the
now which
United-
claim to be
with the
feminists.
United Nations initiative and with all the descriptions of the different forms of feminism there are, how have you proven that it also encompasses and affects people of color as well?
Because what we show specifically is the idea of encompassing women as a whole.
Did you bring
Therefore,
anything?
women as a whole does not include race. Women as a whole includes
So when
women.
the affirmative brings statistics stating that it's disproportionately done, do we win that argument in today's round?
Well, no, because the entire idea of disproportion you're arguing deals specifically with race. What
Just-
we're looking at is the idea of whether or not specifically it affects. All right, is everyone ready? Okay, I'd like to thank you all again. So the first thing I'm going to do is hop right into some of the last refutation that we have. Now, once again, the idea of discrimination among women. What they're specifically wanting to point out is that, hey, well, we also have a racial gap here. Well, look, the problem isn't specifically covering whether or not race is actually the problem. What we're looking at is whether or not feminism is actually detrimental to equal rights. And what we have shown specifically is that the ideal of feminism, what true feminism does, is specifically equate the rights of the sexes, meaning that men and women are equal on all levels. This means in the job market, this means in education. What we see is specifically that these fields are starting to be covered for, and this is what it focuses on. Now, I'm sorry if my opponent specifically is mad at the idea that they're not necessarily focusing on race. But if we actually look at the African American movement that specifically happened in the South, what we see specifically is not only the freedom of slaves, but even over time, this was something that became a focus. Why? Because there was an inequality. Therefore, if we're solving for inequality, then that in and of itself fixes itself. So, when we look at this overall, going back to the off case, what we see number one is what feminism really is. They're arguing specifically that feminism looks bad, but at the same time does not look at what its core is. Once again, defining feminism, what we see is specifically it's the belief that men and women should have equal rights. Therefore, at the point that you say that somehow that this is an idea that isn't involved in feminism, then where exactly does this play out, with, especially in your definition, where it doesn't say specifically that it's discriminating against anyone else outside of women? The second thing we need to look at specifically is the second contention, the idea of relevance. This isn't something that someone's just screaming about saying, oh my gosh, the man's abusing me. What we see is that these inequalities exist in the workplace, they exist in education, and they exist across the world, even within America. At the point that the inequality is still there, it's something that needs to be solved for, and what feminism is doing is ultimately still solving for that problem. So when we look at the third contention, the idea of the benefits, once again, looking at the benefits specifically, what we see specifically is that over this course of time, feminism has still benefited. What we see is that, number one, what my opponent did also bring up, the idea of rape including men. This is something that initially did not happen. What we see here is still inequality. So, it does not necessarily just make rights equal for women, but also balances these rights. Therefore, as a balance, what we also see is equality coming to fruition. So with that, I would like to, for the last time, thank all of you for being here. Thank our opponents for putting together such a wonderful case. And I would like to stand down.
probably a very rapid, fast-paced speech. We're trying to cover the last two speeches of the negative, basically showing to you how their points flow to the side of the affirmative. Let's go ahead and start at the top of the flow. First, I believe there's a confusion on exactly what we're talking about with this idea of race within feminism itself. We're not trying to change the definition or skew the resolution. I believe the negative is a bit confused on that. What we're saying is that the discussion of feminism is basically become a Western white woman idea. It's a discussion it's very westernized. It's a discussion of white women's problems among other white women. It may strive to encompass other sexes, or it may want to encompass other races and things such as that. However, we see that is not the case. We see basically this idea of the self-victimizing idea happening within the status quo. And I talk about how it's a perception that is bad, that this perception of feminism that is bad, and not the movement itself. However, where is this perception stemming from? It wasn't just created out of the blue, out of nowhere. It didn't just vaporize or whatever. What happened is that it's perceived based on what feminists do themselves. It's perceived based on the actions that happen. Feminism undermines discussion between the sexes to resolve this problem. Why? Because as we talked about in our own case, which wasn't really adequately addressed by the side of the negative, we talked about this idea of how it's a form of discussion and dialogue for women about their problems. That is what feminism is. It is saying we as women are disenfranchised. We are set on a lower scale than other individuals. Why? Because the hierarchy. A hierarchy in which men are on top. If they're saying that we're at the bottom, the hierarchy is bad, men are on top, we're the victims in the situation, what is that idea include? It's basically outlining men and saying you cannot be a part of this discussion because you are the ones that are creating this problem. We have this idea of this hierarchy in mind, and that's what feminism is targeting and discussing in today's debate round. We also talked about how it's this self-centered, how we have this muted group theory, this muted group idea happening within the status quo, and that is why we see this happening. We talk about this idea of discrimination. Just because you say discrimination doesn't mean you're addressing African Americans and other groups overall. We as the affirmative say we should be talking about equal rights overall. We should be talking about gender. We should be talking about race and sex and the color of your skin, whatever it might be. Equal rights for all, not just white women, not just Western women sitting in the corner of a room saying we're going to talk about our problems, we're going to try to further ourselves. It's our turn to have the stage now. No, that's not what that is not what this should be about. She said how women overall are paid less. Yes, women overall may be paid less, but guess what? There's a subgroup within that in which African American women are paid less as well, and that's what we're talking about today. Not only do we have feminism itself as seen as a white, Western, woman discussion, but what that does is it disenfranchises women themselves in the group based on race. Why is that so? Because we have this language barrier of women coming to the corner talking about themselves. We have this idea of two ships passing in the night. We're not talking about equal rights overall. We're talking about equal rights overall within feminism. Would we have this African American subgroup within feminism itself? No, we wouldn't. We have this equal form of discussion for everyone, and we see that that is not currently the case. My partner addressed the point of how it leaves out women of color, how it's creating this idea of subgroups, how it's seen as a white Western movement, and some men may be included. Yeah, some of you guys in the audience may be feminists, and it may strive to include men as a whole. However, we see at the point in which women are self-victimizing themselves and basing it on a hierarchy in which men are top, it fundamentally tries to exclude men. And that's what we're talking about in today's debate. We're not saying that feminism, we're not saying that women don't have equal rights. We're not saying that women aren't underpaid within the status quo, because they are. This is a problem. However, and we're not saying that feminism doesn't try to address that, and that doesn't try to prove the rights of women. However, we should be looking at equal rights overall. Thank you.
Going on the top of the flow, I want to hit on a few key ideas brought in the last speech. The opponent speaks about feminism being perceived as the Western white woman idea. I really want to harp upon that. The first contention provided by the negative today is different kinds of feminism, and these encompass different kinds and different races and ethnic groups. We've provided liberal feminism, radical feminism, Marxist and socialist feminism, cultural feminism. Please note that ecofeminism and UA from UAH.edu, you see that different kinds of feminism exist. The perception of it being white, female, westernized is the bad idea. We're not pushing for against races or against homosexuals or against the representation of women as a culture, but you're showing that there are different kinds of feminism, and everything and every of these aims ultimately to gain equal rights. So at the point where there are white feminist groups, for example, and there are African feminist groups, for example, fighting for equal rights, you see that the problems will get solved. I don't see any problem in having this kind of a feminist movement where there are people of different cultures fighting for the same achievement. There is no real refutation to that. All they speak is that African Americans or gays or homosexuals are being undermined. I don't really see that and how it fits into this particular idea of feminism, and it's really not just white or Western women. They just bring up this idea that it's being perceived, but it's really not, because there are different cultural groups also striving for their kind of feminism. That was brought up in the first contention, not new information quoted under the cultural feminism in the first contention. Speaking of that, the second main idea I just want to speak of is just the feminism is not the idea of women for women. There are men too. The He for She campaign, I really want to speak about that, and how the FBI has included men also. It's not just women victimizing themselves. There are many women who are not victims, but then they are raped. I mean, is there their fault? You never know. The point is, there are not everybody who's a woman is not victimizing themselves. At this point, men are also victims sometimes, and also women are being abused of their Women are being abused too. So you're not excluding men out of this idea. Men are also fighting for feminism. I really want to include that in your flow as well. With that, quick reasons for you to vote for the affirmative, for the negative right away. Number one, if feminism focuses on equal rights and not victimization, you really vote for the negative. Because at the end of the day, there are many different kinds of feminism, ultimately aiming and gaining for something. The second contention really brought on by the affirmative speaks about how women perceive themselves first as black, then as women. I also spoke about how subjective that is. I was trying to continue that in my first speech of Viola Davis. She went, during her acceptance speech for her award, she spoke that I'm a woman and then I'm a black, and then how it is so motivating for her to win that particular award. I'm just speaking that it's really subjective. You really never know how women are going to perceive themselves until it is subjective to their own selves. Now, with that being said, next, the reasons for you to vote also go to the benefits. At the point where there are so many harms faced by different kinds of women, for different kinds of problems with education, and you see many benefits happening due to this movement of feminism, like the FBI including rape, like the representation increasing, but even then it is less than 50%. That is the reason we are pushing for gender equality, gender rights. All these reasons ask you to vote for the negative. Thank you. Support feminism.
The judges ready. All right. I want to just do a quick thank you because we have a lot to cover in today's round. I want to make something very clear, judges. It doesn't matter what feminism wants to encompass. It doesn't matter if men are a part of feminism. It doesn't matter that the definition of feminism it is an umbrella for all women. What matters is what's happening within the status quo. What are we seeing from feminism? When you get statistics given to you by the negative team in today's round that show you that women in other countries that are of color, that aren't westernized, aren't succeeding from feminism, you see right there that feminism itself only focuses on white women. Now today the affirmative isn't getting up here and saying feminism, the definition of it is exactly this, but we are giving you the tangible evidence to state so. I want to show you again, fighting for wages for women in America. According to the Huffington Post, women of color are paid less than the average white woman. Wage inequality is worse. So when you see within the status quo, even the things that are trying to be strived for from feminism is affecting the black women or women of color negatively, you see that it detrimental equality. The affirmative in today's round is advocating for equality as a whole, equality for everyone. They say that there is, it's interesting, they say that there's different types of feminism. There's radical feminism, there's liberal feminism, there's cultural feminism. It's funny that all of these things have to be made. Because feminism itself is only focusing on the white female. So when you see cultural feminism, but we aren't seeing any benefits from that because the cultural feminism and the African American women still aren't getting their wages. We see that feminism is detrimental as a whole. When we have quotes in today's round that state it's time for women in America and all the gay men, the people of color, to fight for us now. When my opponent, Mr. Brown, gets up here and states that there was a black movement and slaves were freed, that is the exact type of ideology and thinking that the affirmative is against in today's round. Black people still have issues and problems. Gay people still have issues and problems. Our first contention shows you how feminism blurs the scope. It blurs the scope and only focuses on one facet of an individual, a white female. The quotation, my opponent stated that it's subjective, it's different, and benefits of representation, and we're getting representation. Let's think of a representation of a woman within the status quo. Hillary Clinton. Hillary Clinton's white. Let's look how feminism is directly affecting the communities. When we give you evidence that states that these communities are still being harmed in feminism, it's blurring the scope, the affirmative wins the round because equal rights for everyone, not just white women. Thank you.